Hey guys, Dr. Brown here with another exciting histology video. You didn't get to hear my dulcet tones in the last module, so I thought I'd include a little self-made video here to walk you through the neuron. The nervous system, as we know, has over 10 billion cells, and the functional cells in those systems is the neuron. So when we say the functional unit of the nervous system, what we mean is the smallest piece of an organ. A functional unit is the smallest piece of an organ that's doing the job of the whole organ. And since it's the job of the nervous system to communicate, the neuron is the cell that facilitates that function, that is responsible for that communication. And they're able to do this because neurons exhibit two special characteristics. Like muscle cells, neurons are irritable or excitable, meaning they respond to an electrical stimulus, or in the case of, kind of the natural function of the human body, they're going to respond to an electrochemical stimulus. But the other important characteristic that neurons exhibit is they're able to propagate that signal from themselves to some other cell. And we'll talk about how they do that later on in this lesson. But for now, keep that in the back of your mind. Neurons are able to carry out their job because they are both irritable and they are able to propagate signals from one cell to the next. A neuron has three main pieces or parts to it. So if we're going to discuss the general morphology of a neuron, we need to know what those parts are. The trophic center of the cell, that is the place where we find most of our organelles, is here. And this part of the cell is called, most commonly, the soma, meaning body. So you'll hear me talk about neuronal cell bodies, or soma. But your textbook uses the term perikaryon, which means around, peri meaning around. Karyos is that Greek word meaning kernel, but in biology it's what we use to refer to a nucleus. So eukaryotes have that true nucleus. So perikaryon literally means around the nucleus. And then coming into the perikaryon are one or more branched processes. So this thing right here, this thing right here, and these are called dendrites, which means little branches. And the dendrites and the soma together make up what we call the receptive portion of the cell, meaning this is the part of the cell where electrochemical signals are coming in. So the dendrites and the soma are where signals are coming into the cell. Now, if the amount of signaling coming into the cell, if the stimulatory signaling reaches a certain threshold amount, then the cell will then propagate that signal to the next cell down, and it will do that via this long process extending out from the cell, and this little guy here is called the axon. A neuron can have many dendrites. It can have as few as one, or it can have many hundreds of dendrites, but generally you only see a single axon coming out of the neuron. The axon is considered the conductive segment because it is the one that is conducting this electrochemical signal from the soma of this cell to the next cell down. But the actual transmission of the electrochemical signal is going to happen at the tip of the axon at a special cell-cell junction known as the synapse. Spell it right. So the synapse is the actual transmissive portion. This is the part that M-I-S-S-I-V-E, pardon the handwriting. So it's the synapse that's actually going to transmit the signal from this neuron to the next cell down. And that next cell down the line may be another neuron. It may be a muscle cell. It may be a secretory cell. But the synapse is how the message gets from this neuron to the next cell down. So let's look at some different ways that we can classify neurons. The first way is morphologically. We can classify them based on their shape. The most common shape you're going to find, and we'll just sketch it out here, is a neuron with multiple dendrites and a single axon. Something like this. So there's the axon terminus. It's branched. And here we have, dendrites coming in, and dendrites can be highly branched. It's called arborization. We'll learn more about this as we're learning about the details about these specific structures. So there'll be another video where we're learning about the details about dendrites and axons and soma, etc. And there's our nucleus. So because this neuron has many dendrites attached to the cell body, as well as the axon coming out of the cell body, the cell body has many poles. So we refer to this as a multipolar neuron. These are the most common neurons. 99% of the time when I show you a picture of a neuron in one of these videos or in your lessons in class, it's going to be a multipolar neuron. These are by far the most common neuron type found in the nervous system. One of the least common neurons, but still very, very interesting, is one where we have a single dendrite coming into the cell. We have our soma here, so there's our nucleus, and then once again we've got an axon coming out. So the cell body, or soma or perikaryon, of this cell has two poles, right? It has a dendritic pole here and an axonic pole here. So we would refer to this cell as bipolar neuron. These are really rare. Probably the best known example are the bipolar cells in the retina of your eye, and these are responsible for transmitting some of the visual information between the rods and the cones and the cells that actually make up your optic nerve. And then finally, the really another slightly more common, but not as common as multipolar cells, are cells in which we have a single dendrite going into a single axon, like so, and the cell body, soma, perikaryon, whatever you want to call it, sits off to the side. So there's our axon terminus there. Here's the dendritic fibers coming in, and then here's our soma off to the side. There's the nucleus. So this neuron, we only have a single pole attached to the soma. So you would think we would call this a unipolar neuron, but that would imply that there's either only an axon or only a dendrite. And in fact, there's both a dendrite and an axon. The cell contains the same components as the bipolar cell. It's just that the perikaryon is stuck off to the side. So it's not truly unipolar. So we're going to call this a pseudo-unipolar neuron. These are really common sensory neurons, especially like in the ganglia just off the side of the spinal cord, what we call the dorsal root ganglion. We find the cell bodies of a lot of pseudo-unipolar neurons, and these are bringing in general sensory information, often like touch information from the periphery. So whenever you touch something and feel it, you can know that it's a pseudo-unipolar neuron that's bringing that touch information from the touch receptors in your skin to your brain. So those are morphological classifications. We're classifying the neurons based on their shape. We can also classify neurons based on their function or physiology. So physiologically, we can have sensory neurons. This image is a confocal micrograph of the nasal mucosa. And up in here, we can see those are the cell bodies here. These are the dendrites coming into the cell, and you can't hardly make out, but there are axons back behind all of this fluorescent signal that are coming out here. So these are sensory neurons, meaning that they are bringing information about the external environment into the central nervous system. You can also have sensory neurons that tell the central nervous system about the internal environment. For example, what is your blood pressure? But sensory neurons are any neuron that is coming into the CNS. So we refer to them also as afferent neurons because they are traveling toward the CNS. The counterpart to these are motor neurons. Now, their name implies that they're going to some kind of muscle. And in fact, many of your motor neurons are in fact going to muscle, just like the one we're looking at here. This is a lower motor neuron from the spinal cord. So this is a neuron whose axon would eventually become part of the nerve that goes out and tells a skeletal muscle to move. So these neurons are operating under voluntary control. But a motor neuron is any neuron that is going outward, that's leaving the CNS and going to some sort of peripheral effector. So motor neuron is synonymous with efferent neuron, or I tend to pronounce these afferent and efferent, not because that's the correct pronunciation, but because of my accent. It's often difficult to tell which one I'm talking about unless I really put a lot of emphasis on that first letter. So the reason that I pronounce these so hard is due solely to my redneckery and has nothing to do with proper scientific pronunciation. So we have sensory neurons coming into the CNS, we have motor neurons going out of the CNS, and we also have interneurons that connect other neurons within the central nervous system. So interneurons are contained almost entirely in the CNS, and in the simplest neuronal circuits, that is, a neuronal circuit is where we have some sort of input, a decision is made, and then some sort of output results from that. Those simplest neuronal circuits contain a single sensory neuron, a single interneuron, and a single motor neuron. So interneurons are inside the CNS, and they're connecting other stuff and things. And then finally, we have neurosecretory cells. Let's write this out. Cool. So these cells we're seeing here inside the adrenal medulla are neurons that are not so much for conducting electrochemical signals as they are for, as their name implies, secreting something. So the adrenal medulla contains neurosecretory cells that secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine as hormones. There are neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus of the brain that make hypothalamic hormones as well as posterior pituitary hormones. But any neuronal cell that has specialized for secretion is now called a neurosecretory cell. So in review, a single neuron is going to have a soma. It's going to have some dendrites coming in. It's going to have an axon going out. The soma or perikaryon or cell body and the dendrites make up the receptive portion. The axon makes up the conductive segment, and then the synapse at the end of the axon would be the transmissive segment. And then we can classify neurons either morphologically as multipolar, bipolar, or pseudo-unipolar. There is a fourth kind of neuron called anaxonic neurons, but we're not going to get into them because as far as I know, nobody's figured out exactly what they do just yet. And then finally, we can classify neurons physiologically as being sensory or afferent, pardon the accent. They can be motor or efferent, efferent. They can be interneurons connecting sensory and motor neurons in the CNS, or they can be neurosecretory, where they're usually secreting some sort of hormone. So that's it for now. That's kind of our introduction to the neuron. In the next video, we're going to dive right in and get into some of the more specifics of the functional neuronal anatomy. So we're going to look at how the dendrites, the soma, and the axon gain their functionality. So we're going to kind of get into some ultrastructure stuff and things. So I hope that was informative and you had a good time. Study hard, and we'll see you later.